The most feared warriors in medieval Europe landed in North America and were driven out in less than a decade. Not by another empire, not by a rival king, by people whose name we still don't know, people the Norse called Skraelings, a word that may have meant screechers or simply foreigners. We know what the Vikings called them. We still don't know what they call the Vikings. And that silence, that gap in the record is where this story really lives. This is Epochal. And today, we're not just investigating the Vikings who reached North America. We're investigating the people who stopped them and asking why history forgot both. Let's start with the object. In the summer of 1021 CE, we know the date almost exactly now. Norse settlers on the northeastern tip of Newfoundland lit a fire inside a small stone building. Inside that building, they built the first iron forge ever lit in the Western Hemisphere. Think about what that means for a moment. The very first time iron was smelted on this side of the Atlantic. It happened here in a place that would be forgotten for almost 1,000 years. But here's the thing that should stop you cold. They built it, and then they left. Within roughly 10 years, the forge went dark. The longhouses were empty. The Norse were gone. Why? That's the question this whole investigation turns on. And to answer it, we have to go back 500 years before Columbus, to a world on the edge of its own map. By the late 900s CE, the Norse had already done something extraordinary. They had colonized Iceland, then Greenland, a civilization pushing west, generation by generation, following the coastline of the North Atlantic like a thread unspooling into the unknown. Greenland was not a comfortable place to be. The colony there, which was the jumping-off point for everything that followed, numbered only around 2,500 people. That's it. The entire base of Norse operations in the Western Atlantic was smaller than a modern small town. And yet, from that tiny outpost, some of them looked further west and went. The sagas tell us that a man named Leif Erikson was among the first to land on North American shores. He called the new land Vinland, wine land, likely for the grapes or berries he found growing wild. Now, where exactly Vinland was, scholars still debate that. Don't let anyone tell you it's settled. What is settled is that Lance Ox Meadows in northern Newfoundland is the only confirmed Norse settlement in the Americas, full stop. We know the date now with startling precision. Researchers used a method called dendrochronology, tree ring dating, calibrated to a cosmic solar event in 993 CE that left a chemical fingerprint in wood worldwide. The logs cut at Lance Ox Meadows, D21 CE. Not approximately, exactly. A solar flare that happened in 993 CE, nearly 30 years before the Norse arrived, left a mark in the wood that scientists could read like a timestamp 1,000 years later. That's the kind of detective work that makes history feel alive. So by 1021, a small group of Norse settlers, estimates range from 30 to 160 people, had established themselves at the very edge of the known world. They had the forge, they had shelters, they had supplies from Greenland, 4,000 kilometers east. By any measure, this should have worked. These were skilled navigators, experienced colonizers, and battle-hardened survivors. Greenland was worse, and they made it work there for generations. So what went wrong in Vinland? Here's where the story fractures, because we have two sources, and they don't agree. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red are the only written accounts of what happened in Vinland, and they tell different stories. Let's call this clue number 1, the two-saga contradiction. The saga of the Greenlanders is generally considered older and closer to the original oral tradition. It places multiple voyages to Vinland, multiple families involved, and the decisive conflict as a military defeat at the hands of the Skraelings. The saga of Eric the Red, on the other hand, consolidates the voyages into one, prominently features a woman named Gudrid, and places more blame on internal Norse conflict for the retreat. The Skraelings are still present, but the emphasis shifts. Both sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe. Both are based on oral tradition. Both contain details that archaeology supports and details it cannot confirm, so neither one wins outright. What we're left with is the gap between them. And now let's flip the camera entirely, because everything you've heard so far has been the Norse perspective. Let's talk about who was already there. When the Norse arrived in Vinland, North America was not empty. It was home to peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. The Norse encountered them almost immediately, and the accounts suggest both sides were completely unprepared for what they were looking at. Historians debate which indigenous group the Norse encountered. The most likely candidates are the ancestors of the Dorset culture, a people who had inhabited the northeastern coast of North America for thousands of years before the Norse arrived, or possibly ancestors of the Beothuk people. Either way, what matters is the scale. The Norse at Elands Meadows numbered at most 160 people, backed by a Greenland colony of 2,500. The indigenous populations of northeastern North America, by contrast, numbered in the tens of thousands. Now, the early contacts were not immediately violent. The sagas describe trading, the Norse offering red cloth, receiving furs in return. There is something remarkable in that image. Two civilizations meeting for the first time in human history, exchanging goods across a language barrier neither could cross. But the sagas record that Thorfinn Karlsefni, the Norse leader of the most substantial settlement attempt, gave his men an explicit order: do not trade weapons with the Skraelings. No swords, no axes, no iron. That order tells us something important. The Norse knew the Skraelings were capable fighters. They were not underestimating them. They were afraid of what would happen if those weapons changed hands. And now we reach clue number 2, the bull. This is the detail that almost nobody talks about, and it may be the most bizarre turning point in the entire story. The saga of the Greenlanders records that during one of the trading encounters, a Norse bull, an animal the Skraelings had never seen before, charged out from the settlement and ran wild. The Skraelings fled in terror. The Norse thought they had won a psychological victory. They were wrong. The retreat was temporary. 3 days later, according to the saga, the Skraelings returned in force. The trading was over. The sagas describe a battle. Projectile weapons, described as something like catapults or slings with large projectile balls, were used by the Skraelings to devastating effect. Some historians suggest these may have been bolas or large throwing weapons, though the exact technology isn't confirmed. The Norse had iron. They had better individual weapons. But the sagas record that Karlsefni's men began to flee, and that the retreat was only halted by an act of defiant courage from a woman named Freydis, who, depending on which saga you read, grabbed a sword and turned to face the attackers alone. The battle itself was not a massacre. The sagas record casualties on both sides, but the strategic reality was clear. With only 160 settlers against thousands of capable and determined defenders 4,000 kilometers from their nearest support base, Karlsefni could not win a war of attrition. And here is where the second saga diverges. The saga of Eric the Red suggests the internal tensions among the Norse, quarrels over resources, disputes between different family factions, contributed as much to the retreat as the Skraeling military pressure. Maybe it was both. An outpost under external military pressure and internal fracture is a very specific recipe for collapse, one that has repeated throughout history. The Vinland settlement didn't fail because the Norse were weak. It failed because they were too few, too far from home and surrounded. Within roughly 10 years of building that forge, and possibly as few as 3, the Norse departed Vinland. They took their tools. They let the fires go out. They sailed back toward Greenland and left behind an empty coast, a cold hearth, and a story nobody would believe for almost 1,000 years. Now let's sit with the Skraeling perspective for a moment, because they deserve more than a footnote. They won. Let that land. The most feared ocean-crossing warriors the medieval world had produced, the same people who had raided England, sacked Paris, colonized Iceland and Greenland, attempted to settle North America. And the people already living there said no. Not with treaties, not with diplomacy, with organized, sustained military pressure. Consider what that means. The Norse failed in Vinland not because they were incompetent, but because the defenders were effective. The people the sagas dismissed with an insulting nickname held the line. North America stayed unconquered by Europeans for another 500 years. 500 years. That's how much time passed between the Norse withdrawal and Columbus's arrival. 500 years of North American history that unfolded without European interference because of what happened in Vinland. Now here's clue number 3, and it's the one that haunts the whole story. The Norse did not keep this a secret. The sagas were told, the stories circulated in Scandinavia and Iceland. People knew or could have known that there was land across the Atlantic, and yet nobody acted on it. No second expedition returned to reclaim the forge. No Norse king funded a new colony. The knowledge existed and then essentially faded. Why? Some historians point to simple practicality. The Greenland colony was struggling. Sustaining a North American outpost 4,000 kilometers beyond an already precarious base was logistically impossible at that scale. The math didn't work. Others suggest the Norse simply lacked the population pressure that would later drive European colonization. When you have only 2,500 people in Greenland, you don't have a surplus to send into a hostile unknown. The engine that would later drive conquest simply didn't exist yet. And then there are the Skraelings themselves, or rather what they represented, a people capable of organized military resistance, operating on home terrain with local knowledge, in numbers the Norse could not match. The word must have gotten back to Greenland. Vinland fights back. Now let's talk about what was actually found at Lands Meadows, because the physical evidence is extraordinary and it adds detail the sagas alone cannot provide. 8 structures have been identified at the site, 3 large halls, 4 smaller buildings, and 1 that stands apart, the iron smithy, the forge. Inside it, archaeologists found iron slag, a small ember pit, and evidence of the bloom smelting process used to produce iron from bog ore. Bog ore, that's the key detail here. The Norse didn't bring raw iron across the Atlantic. They found iron ore in the local bogs and smelted it on site. That means they were already planning to stay. They were building infrastructure for a permanent presence, not a temporary camp. They also found a bronze ring-headed pin of Norse style, butternuts, a nut native to areas south of Newfoundland, suggesting the Norse were venturing further south than Lands Meadows itself, trading or exploring along the coast. The site was discovered in 1960 by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steen Ingstad, after Helge asked a local fisherman if there were any old ruins in the area. The fisherman led him straight to them. Sometimes history is that simple and that astonishing. Lands Meadows became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978, one of the first sites ever designated, and the ongoing archaeology hasn't stopped. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar are currently being used to search for additional Norse sites further along the coast. As of 2024 and 2025, researchers have been conducting systematic satellite archaeology searches for additional Norse sites in Atlantic Canada. The work suggests Lands Meadows may have been one node in a larger and still undiscovered Norse network along the coast. We may not be at the end of this story. We may be closer to the middle. That forge that went dark in 21 CE might have had neighbors we haven't found yet. But let's come back to the central mystery, the one the 2 sagas leave unresolved. Was this a military defeat, an internal collapse, a combination of both? And does the answer even matter given what the result was? Here's what the physical evidence tells us. The site was not burned, not destroyed in battle. The structures were left standing. Tools were left behind. The departure appears to have been orderly, which argues against a sudden catastrophic military defeat that overran the settlement itself. But the sagas are equally clear that skirmishes happened. Casualties occurred. The Norse did not leave simply because they got homesick. The Skraeling military pressure was real, even if it was not the only factor at work. Most historians today read both sagas as partially correct, one emphasizing the external pressure, the other, the internal fracture, and see the departure as the result of both working together. A settlement at the edge of the world, squeezed from outside and cracking from within. And so the forge went cold, the ships departed. The coast returned to the people who had always lived there, and one of the most consequential near misses in all of human history quietly disappeared from the world's memory. Here's what makes this story genuinely strange. If the Norse had succeeded, if Karlsefni had held Vinland, expanded it, returned with more settlers, what happens to North America? What happens to the indigenous civilizations? What happens to the next 500 years of history? We can't answer that. History doesn't run alternate simulations, but the question itself reveals something. The people who drove the Norse out didn't just win a battle, they altered the trajectory of the continent. Without knowing it, they changed everything that came after. Now we reach the deepest layer of this mystery, the one that goes beyond archaeology and sagas and brings us to a question about memory itself. Why did history forget? The Norse left around 1021 CE. Columbus arrived in 1492 CE. That's nearly 500 years, and in those 500 years, nothing. No Norse expedition returned. No European power followed up on the knowledge that land existed to the west. The sagas circulated in Iceland and Scandinavia, but as stories, not as navigational intelligence that got acted upon. The knowledge existed. The follow-through did not. Part of the answer may lie in the fate of Greenland itself. The Norse Greenland colony, already small and struggling, eventually disappeared entirely by the 15th century. It simply faded. The Western Norse outpost collapsed before anyone could use it as a staging point for a second attempt at Vinland. And so the people who first crossed the Atlantic to reach the Americas, the people who built that forge, who fought those battles, who named that land Vinland, vanished from the record so completely that for centuries, Columbus was credited with discovering a continent that two civilizations already knew existed. Columbus gets the statues. The Vikings got there 500 years earlier, and the world just forgot. And the people who actually stopped European colonization for half a millennium, they never even got a real name in the record, just Skraelings. Think about that. The people who delayed European colonization of North America by 5 centuries, the ones who looked at the most feared warriors of the medieval world and held their ground, history couldn't even be bothered to remember their name. There's a kind of existential vertigo in that, because it means that the most consequential resistance in pre-Columbian American history was conducted by people who left no written record, and was recorded only by the people they repelled, who couldn't even bring themselves to use a respectful name. History is written by those who survived long enough to write it down. The Norse survived Vinland, they just went home. The indigenous peoples survived the Norse, and then survived 5 more centuries before finally facing a colonization they couldn't repel. The sagas only exist because one side had scribes. So here is the real investigation, the one beneath all the sagas and the archaeology and the satellite imagery. Who controls what we remember? Who decides which stories get told and which ones go dark like a forge abandoned on a windswept coast? The Norse didn't hide what happened in Vinland. They sang it, told it, eventually wrote it down. But the world wasn't listening, or wasn't in a position to act. And the people who actually won at Vinland didn't have a writing tradition that would preserve their version for scholars to find 1,000 years later. 2 civilizations met at the edge of the known world. Both walked away changed. One wrote it down, the other held the land. History remembered the one that wrote and forgot the one that held. Now here's where we bring this home, because this story isn't just about the past. There's a pattern here that repeats across every era, including our own. A small group reaches somewhere new, builds something remarkable, a forge, a settlement, an idea, and then retreats under pressure. What they built doesn't survive, what they encountered does. The question history asks about people like Karl Sefni is, did you arrive too early or with too little? And the Skraelings, those unnamed, unnumbered defenders of a coastline most of the world had never heard of, they ask a different question of us. What does it take to hold your ground against something completely unknown, against people who arrive with iron and ships and no intention of asking permission? They held, without knowing who the strangers were, without understanding what an iron forge meant for the future, without any way to know that 5 centuries later, another wave would come, and that one they could not stop. In LN 21 CE, they couldn't have known any of that. They only knew what was in front of them, strangers who had arrived on their coast, built a fire and refused to leave. And they dealt with it, methodically, effectively, and completely. The forge at Lance Ox Meadows went cold in roughly 1031 CE. The first iron ever smelted in the Western Hemisphere, used for a decade, maybe less, then abandoned. It sat in the earth for almost 930 years before anyone found it again. When Helge Ingstad first looked at those turf mounds in 1960, he was looking at something that had been invisible to the historical record for 9 centuries. The Norse had been there. The evidence was there. The world just hadn't been looking. That's the thing about history. It doesn't disappear. It waits, in tree rings, in slag heaps, in the shape of ground that once held walls, in sagas that survived in Icelandic manuscripts because someone thought the stories worth keeping. History hides until someone asks the right question. And the right question, the one this whole investigation has been building toward, isn't who got there first. We know that now within a single year, confirmed by a solar storm that happened 30 years before any of them were born. The real question is what the departure means, because the Norse left a continent behind, and the people who were already there, who had no way of knowing what was coming half a millennium later, continued their lives on that coast, in those forests, on those rivers, unchanged by the encounter, unrecorded by it. Here's the reflection I want to leave you with. Every era has its Vinland moment. A small group arrives somewhere new, certain they have the tools, the will, the resources, and discovers that the place already belongs to someone who isn't leaving. The Norse had iron. The Skraelings had numbers, knowledge, and 5,000 years of living on that specific coastline. Iron and courage matter, but so does knowing where you are and knowing that you were there first. And there's a quieter thought hiding inside this story. The Norse came from a civilization that valued courage above almost everything else. Their sagas celebrated those who went furthest, risked most, returned with stories no one had heard before. And yet Vinland became by Norse standards a story of failure, not honored in stone monuments, not expanded upon. The sagas told it, but the civilization moved on. Sometimes the stories that would tell us the most are the ones we file away and don't act on. In your own life, what's your Vinland? What have you attempted, reached the edge of, and pulled back from, not because you failed, but because the conditions weren't right yet? The Norse didn't fail because they weren't brave. They failed because bravery alone doesn't hold a settlement. And on the other side of that question, the Skraeling side, what has held the line for you? What territory, interior or external, have you defended against something that arrived with more resources, more tools, more certainty that it belonged there, and held it anyway? These are the questions that 1021 CE leaves us with. A year that most people alive today have never heard of, confirmed by a solar storm that burned across the sky over 1,000 years ago, preserved in tree rings that nobody read until now. There are people whose names we will never know who held a coastline against the greatest maritime power of the medieval world, and won. Their victory is preserved not in writing, but in the simple fact that North America was not a Norse colony when Columbus arrived. That's not a small thing. That may be the most consequential military outcome of the entire medieval period, and we don't even know what the winners called themselves. The forge at Elandsauks Meadows is still there. You can visit it. Stand over the ember pit where the first iron in the Western Hemisphere was smelted, run your hand along the cold stone walls, and think about the decade of history that passed inside that small building before someone decided it wasn't worth the cost. Across the site, you can walk through the reconstructed longhouses where Karl Sefni's people slept and argued and planned. Stand where Freydis may have stood. Look out at the same strait of water the Skraelings crossed when they came back after the bull. History isn't a fixed thing. It shifts every time someone asks a new question or uses a solar storm to read a tree ring. And the story of the people who stopped the Vikings is just now getting the investigation it deserves. Satellite imagery is searching the Newfoundland coast right now for more Norse sites. New papers are being published. New questions are being asked. What if Elandsauks Meadows was not an isolated outpost, but a node in a larger network? What did the Norse find further south along the coast? And who exactly were the Skraelings? Research into the Dorset culture, the Beothuk, and the ancestors of modern Algonquian peoples continues. Their descendants are still here. Their story told from their side is still waiting to be fully assembled. The two sagas will keep contradicting each other. The forge will keep sitting in the earth of Newfoundland. The tree rings will hold their cosmic timestamp. And somewhere under the turf of the North Atlantic coast, more answers may still be waiting for someone to ask the right question. The most feared warriors in medieval Europe reached North America in 1021 CE. They built the first iron forge in the Western Hemisphere. They were driven out by people whose names history never recorded, and they left a continent behind that would stay unconquered for another 5 centuries. Columbus gets the statues. The Vikings get the discovery credit, at least among those who know, but the people who actually held the line, who looked at iron and ships and warriors and refused to yield, they get a word that means foreigners in someone else's language, and a silence that lasted nearly 1,000 years. That silence is the real mystery. Not where Vinland was, not which saga is right, not what the forge produced. The real mystery is how a victory that shaped the next 5 centuries of North American history managed to disappear so completely that most people alive today have never heard of the people who achieved it. This is Epochal. If this investigation changed how you think about who wrote the history you were taught, drop a comment below. Tell us who you think the Skraelings were. Tell us what you think should have happened differently. Tell us what your Vinland is. If you've made it to the end of this investigation, if you sat with the forge and the sagas and the nameless defenders of a coastline, then subscribe. Every week, Epochal investigates the stories that built the world and the ones history couldn't quite manage to remember.